the problem for Russia has been not only that a lot of these people don't have the experience, but also Russia did not have enough weapons to equip them with. So that was one of the challenges that it was facing earlier on. Now, Russia continues currently this practice of seeking contract soldiers, whether from inside Russia or even from abroad. And Putin is currently promising not to use mobilized soldiers for conflict, for the war in Ukraine, but it is very difficult to believe these promises.
Russia's military death toll in Ukraine has now passed the 50,000 mark, according to new analysis. In the second 12 months on the front line, as Moscow pushed its so-called meat grinder strategy, the body count was nearly 25% higher than in the first year. The overall death toll is 8 times higher than the only official public acknowledgement of fatality numbers. That was given by Moscow in September 2022. So, although this is an estimate, it is believed, of course, that the actual number of Russian deaths is likely to be much higher than 50,000. In a moment, we're going to be joined by Stat Kyiv, features editor at the Kyiv Post. But first, let's speak to Sergey Radchenko, the Wilson H. Smith Distinguished Professor at Johns Hopkins School for International Studies and historian of the Cold War. Sergey, thank you so much for your time.
Sure.
It is a brutal description of a brutal strategy, Russia's meat grinder strategy. For anyone not familiar, I think we can kind of imagine it. What is their current tactic on the front line?
Well, the current tactics on the front line is to use ammunition, to use artillery to basically destroy the territory held by the Ukrainians, and they have been fairly successful with this, because they have a much higher, they have much more artillery than the Ukrainians and much greater amount of ammunition. So they have been making gains. But what you're referring to, of course, is just using sort of human, throwing people into attacks, and they have been doing that. We saw that tactic being used in places like Bakhmut with horrendous results for Russian manpower. But of course, Ukrainians have been taking casualties as well. So as you say, 50,000, that's not even, that doesn't even tops out. It seems that the number is much higher.
Yeah. This is a horrible question, but can Russia afford to use and then lose that number of people?
The question in this kind of conflict is which country can afford it more. And if you look at Russia and Ukraine, their relative populations, of course, Russia has many more people. Russia has something like 140 million people. Ukraine used to have 40 million people. It's very difficult to say how many it has now. So in this situation, obviously, Russia has a manpower advantage. Now, Russia has seen conflicts before where the death rates were much higher, for example, during the Second World War. Now, that's not exactly a good point of comparison. By contrast, in the entire war in Afghanistan, in the 10 years that the Soviets were there, they just lost 13,000 people. That's 1-3. So the current war in Ukraine is obviously on a much bigger scale than the invasion of Afghanistan, but obviously not on a great scale like big wars of the last century.
But Russia appear not to be using, at this point, really, large volumes of trained soldiers. You know, they're recruiting people like prisoners to go to the front line for them, who presumably have had little to none training.
This was a big problem for Russia. The political decision entailed in mobilization is difficult to make. Now, Putin, of course, mobilized some people. And we remember when mobilization was first announced in 2022, there was an outflow of people. People fled Russia in large numbers. Now, many of those returned. But in the meantime, to plug the manpower gap, Russia has been offering money to contract soldiers. Some of those were also promised amnesty. Those have been particularly hired directly from prisons. And the problem for Russia has been not only that a lot of these people don't have the experience, but also Russia did not have enough weapons to equip them with. So that was one of the challenges that it was facing earlier on. Now, Russia continues currently this practice of seeking contract soldiers, whether from inside Russia or even from abroad. And Putin is currently promising not to use mobilize soldiers for conflict, for the war in Ukraine, but it is very difficult to believe these promises.
Yeah, well, of course. Sergey, thank you so much for your analysis. Professor at Johns Hopkins School for International Studies, historian of the Cold War as well. Listening to that was Sasha Luki, features editor at Kyiv Post. Sasha, thank you so much for talking to us. I guess one of the critical differences between Russian troops and those in Ukraine is the difference of sentiment for the Ukrainians who fiercely want to defend their territory. In terms of losses and sentiment and how they are feeling on the front line, how would you currently assess kind of the feelings of those fighting for Ukraine right now?
Well, given the fact that many people feel as if, particularly the United States, is almost leaving them in the lurch, they're bracing themselves for a longer, more protracted war, in the sense that they probably have to figure out how to defend territory without the necessary artillery. One of the recent changes in Russian tactics has been the use of glide bombs, where they drop basically dumb bombs with wings that are not very accurate, but they're half-ton to one-ton bombs. The planes stay outside of air defense, Ukraine's air defense capabilities, because a lot of the air defense is placed in cities further west. And rather than using artillery, they just pummel Ukrainian troops. So the Ukrainians have been having difficulty dealing with that. And another change since these meat grinder tactics more recently is the fact that Russian troops, you can't be underestimated. They're actually learning and developing tactics that are adequate to what kind of equipment they still have left. And that's a problem. It's a problem for Ukraine now, but it's also a problem for NATO in the future, in that Russia will have more troops. The other thing is that the Russian troops, unlike in Afghanistan, are probably more motivated now, given the fact that they've been, if not entirely convinced, then convinced enough that they're fighting a war for survival against the collective West and NATO. So there's that issue. The Ukrainians certainly are more motivated because it's obviously an existential threat. But many of the Russian troops are also convinced
Yeah.
that Russia's survival is at stake.
And I guess for people in Ukraine, the laws that have been brought in to lower the age of conscription, are, are the public feeling, well, war weary?
Uh, they're weary, they're bracing themselves. Everyone's tired. There's the conscription problem, because Ukraine has a demographic trough for people around the age of 20, because many left the country before the full-scale invasion, many left the country after. So they didn't want to jeopardize the generation that still hadn't had children, but almost everyone feels that eventually they'll have to, and they'll have to mobilize younger and younger troops.
I'm sure. What do you think we might see then as we head into the summer? This time last year we were talking about the offensive from Ukraine. There was sort of lots of optimism and hope for that. Can you see a breakthrough looming?
Yeah, a breakthrough of the Russian forces in the lines in Donbass, if the Americans don't start sending the necessary ammunition. It's the problem with ammunition is the gravest problem, and even the commander-in-chief Alexander Syrskyi says that the entire front line along the Donbass, the Russians are probing, and they could break through potentially in the summer if we don't get the ammunition.
Stash Luki, features editor at Kyiv Post, thank you so much for just giving us the insight of all the stories you're reporting on. Of course, we here watching the international ramifications play out. Thank you so much.